We are picking up where we left off. We're doing a deep dive into the subject of forgiveness, what it is versus what it is not. That has grown out of an extended series on boundaries, because if you set boundaries on someone or with someone, you are going to find out the nature of not only the relationship, but the person that you're dealing with. And oftentimes, if you've had to set boundaries, there's a good reason why you've had to. And so you're probably not just going to be receiving pushback. So we've talked about degrees of piggishness. That comes out of Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. But you also may be dealing with someone who is further down on the scale as far as narcissism, sociopathy, and psychopathy. Welcome to Journey to Healing. I am John Uhler. We're here every Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We start on time, except sometimes when there's tech issues. But again, we're picking up where we left off. I recommend, so that you can be brought up to speed, I recommend you go to SurvivorSupport.net. Again, SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab. Scroll down and you will see a growing repository, not just of programs, but specifically this series. So we're picking up where we left off last time. I had reviewed a number of charts that deal with God's heart for the oppressed, God's heart for those that have been on the receiving end of injustice, because there is a meme that we have been looking at now for a number of months, which really started this portion of the issue on forgiveness. Right, this idea that you never knew how strong you were until you had to forgive someone who was not sorry and accept an apology you never received. That is a distorted concept that will do nothing good for you other than tie you up in emotional knots, because that is not based in truth. That's not rooted and grounded in truth. That is not biblical for those that come from a Christian perspective. Including Old Testament, if you adhere to that. The idea of justice is what is closest to God's heart. And if we, as we've seen in the past, if we simply turn a blind eye to injustice, or if someone tells us that we have to turn a blind eye, just move on, forgive and forget, bury the hatchet, let bygones be bygones, that does not honor the pain of someone who has been on the receiving end of injustice. God does not do that. Why? Because he cares very much for those that have been harmed. God's heart is a heart of justice. That is the foundation of his throne. Justice responds to injustice. That's why the angels had never seen an aspect of God in terms of his anger. They had never seen that prior to Satan rebelling. Why? Because there had never been injustice. And then, of course, Satan tempted Adam and Eve. We had the fall, and injustice because of selfishness, because of sinfulness, now invaded the human race into the human DNA. And now the norm, unfortunately, is injustice. And that's why God says he is angry every day with the ungodly. So we looked at the difference between those that are eligible for God's forgiveness and our forgiveness, and those who are not, because there's a certain category of people that do things out of ignorance, certain category that will apologize, a certain category whose hearts have been hardened. And we looked at that in the past. When Jesus said, love your enemies, he was talking about the lower category. That was Paul and the Roman soldiers. Those are two examples. He could have chosen from a number of different words in terms of enemies, but he chose, well, he spoke in Aramaic, but the Holy Spirit guided Matthew and Luke to select the correct words. And so poneros has to do with actions, sapros and kakos, we looked at, has to do with essence. So if somebody crosses lines, and we looked at this chart then to show that there are categories and lines beyond which somebody can cross, and they're morphing in terms of their heart condition. Proverbs 1 verses 22, we looked at that. That, of course, is overlaid on the chart that I had created, which we now could call subcategories. And what's important for this chart is to look at the top, and you see how God responds to each category. The simple has to do, and this is not a good thing to be a simpleton, right? To be simple. Or a simpleton is a little bit different than somebody who's simple. Simpleton is on his way down into the simple, but somebody who was simple was somebody that would eventually be open to the other two categories in terms of the bad apple does what to the bunch? It spoils the bunch. So it's going to pull someone down, and eventually the simple will become a mocker. Why? Because he's overriding his conscience. So the negative influence will give way to overriding conscience. And before you know it, somebody who starts out as a simple person ends up becoming a mocker. That is the danger zone, because in that area, conscience is now actively being overridden, and you can get to a point where it no longer works. That's the point of no return. That's when a fool has said in his heart, I'll bring the chart up again. The fool has said in his heart, what? There is no God. And that doesn't mean he has to say it out loud. That just means he has made the final summation in his mind. He has dismissed God as far as being of any importance, any effect. He's dismissed God from his mind. That was Judas. Judas was no closer to God than anybody could be. He walked with Jesus, but he became, by his own choice, Satan possessed because he loved money, right? He sold his soul. And so it's very profound when somebody gives themselves over. And the book of Romans says that a reprobate mind results from being given over. So it's a very active process. So you don't want to violate your conscience, because you will continue to go down. And we talked about what happens when someone violates their conscience. They move from the path of life all the way over to what's called the target zone. But we also talked about how this is not just a static spiritual principle, but somebody is keeping score. So we looked at a couple of different charts. One would be sort of our first version of this, the idea that our little guy there, if you can see him, kind of the upper left-hand corner, he has his little knapsack. What does the knapsack represent? If you've been with us before, that's the little guy with the knapsack. It represents doing what is right, just, and fair. If somebody is selfish and they offload their knapsack, they become the person on the right, and they will pull the person downward by virtue of loading on knapsacks. And that's why Jesus said, do not do what? That's correct. Do not cast your pearls before swine. We've also looked at that is different than when Paul said, bear one another's burdens. So we are to bear those things, help someone out with things that come into their life through living, because they live in a fallen world. That is different than somebody who offloads their knapsack, because if you offload your knapsack onto somebody else, you become oppressive, and they will feel it, right? They are going to be burdened down, not just as far as the boulder, but they will feel the weight of that. So God takes note. And where we left off last time was helping someone see just how much God takes note. So we looked at this chart. This is where we left off last time. I recommend you go back and, again, SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab, and I give an overview of this chart. We have a top and a bottom. The top is what's happening in terms of behavior and, let's say, a thought process and overriding conscience, and they move from left to right, meaning that as they become increasingly selfish, our little guy right about on the left, you can see he has a knapsack, but he's hopped the fence of boundaries. And so he now is doing his own thing, and he's becoming increasingly selfish. And as that happens, then the degree of negative impact that we have on someone starts to increase. And we talked about how then the pain, the sighs, the cries, the injury rises to the heavens. God collects those in a bottle. Psalm 56:8. We also found that word tears is also wanderings, because significant impact, you can have a significant impact on someone where they become biblically an alien. Right? We talked about what were the three categories that Israel would be judged by based upon, in terms of either blessing or curses. It was three categories of people that they had to take care of. Those were the widows, the orphans, and the aliens. An alien was not somebody who was moving countries by choice. They were run out of town. They were, um, because of oppression, they were forced to leave their home. They were excommunicated. They were unsynagogued, as what would happen in Jesus' day. If you remember the story where the man born blind gets his healing, and they want to know, the scribes and Pharisees, was this person really born blind? So they bring the parents in. The parents were afraid to answer. Right? They said, "Well, go ask our son." They asked the parents, "Was your kid really born blind? This is an adult child." And they said, "Why ask us? Ask him. He's of age." They didn't want to say the wrong thing because the scribes and Pharisees would have unsynagogued them. That is blacklisting in a very religiously tight community, meaning they would not be able to buy and sell. They would be shunned, and that was virtually pain worse than death. Why? Because then they would be an alien. So the idea of having to wander because of someone's injustice, really, the extent to which someone was meaningfully and negatively, significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted. Ultimately, that is what God cares about, and God will pick up the issue of justice on behalf of those who have been harmed. So we looked at another chart, which would have been in the last program. We talked about there's a corresponding relationship between the extent to which my ego drives, and that's in the yellow, drives my inner world and my psyche downward. Right in the middle, I become twisted, and then there's a dynamic effect, kind of like the difference between Niagara River versus Niagara Falls, and eventually it really picks up speed. And as I start to pick up speed heading downward, becoming a worse person, more hurtful, then the extent to which the pain of someone else will ascend, and God notices that. So in looking at the chart again, we're picking up where we left off last time. This is the top portion. And what I want you to see, we're going to look at the two aspects of this. So the fact that God captures our tears in a bottle. You see how the sighs and cries of the survivors, the oppressed, the victims, rises to God's heart. I recommend you take a screenshot of this and do not just a word study, but look at the different verses that I have written out. There's way too many to cover for this program. We're going to look at a few. And then as the pain continues, what happens as pain increases? As a matter of fact, look at the thermometers. Flip side of hurt is anger. God feels anger because the extent that we are hurt, God is hurt. And so as the pain increases, God feels that, and he will pick up where we can't defend ourselves. And so you see that right under the A for Avenger, the angry eyes, you see a bow and arrow. Then you see a bowl that's supposed to be equivalent to the bowls of justice that are being poured out in judgment in the book of Revelation. Then you see another kind of bowl, a more dramatic picture, but if you follow that down, you have a heat-seeking missile. Why? Because that is God's promise to avenge. That is how much he cares about survivors. The Jews understood this, and the Jews counted on that. We talked about how the last words of God through Moses had to do with God paying attention to injustice. He would avenge his people. So the question is, who is eligible then? As we see the pain, the sighs, and the cries ascend, let me bring that back. Right? As we see that ascending and God collecting those tears in a bottle, the question is, who is eligible to have God's protective heart? Because as you see next to it, his heart will ensure that not one tear has fallen on deaf ears. It never falls onto the ground. The times that we need to know that God is there is the time that we don't feel it. There's a number of categories. I'm just going to cover a few of these categories to give you a sense of this. He cares about actual murder and actual assault. In Genesis 4:10, if you remember, about Cain and Abel. How long did Cain hate his younger brother Abel? As long as he was able. That's going to help you remember that. It's not funny, but so Cain was angry with his brother because Cain didn't want to look within, didn't want to do enough inventory. So Cain eventually did what? He murdered his brother. So he killed his brother. God then gets Cain's attention by asking a question. God will often ask questions of us to jog our conscience, quite frankly. And so just as God asked Adam a question, Adam, where are you? Because something had changed. God and Adam used to walk together as best friends in the cool of the day in each evening. But suddenly one day, Adam didn't show up. Well, of course, God knew why, but Adam was hiding. He wouldn't come clean. So guilt has a way of causing us to hide. God wants us to deal with that. So just as God asked Adam a question, then of course he asked Eve, and then, well, he didn't ask the snake any question, right? But he asked Cain a question, where's your brother? And of course, Cain, true to form for anybody who's not going to come clean, is going to deflect, going to justify, rationalize. He says, am I my brother's keeper? And then what does God say? He says, Cain, what have you done? And a very powerful statement. He says, listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Does blood literally cry out? Of course not. But the life is in the blood. Our pain matters to God. It ascends to God. And that's what people who have been literally harmed need to know, that God was paying attention. But it's not just the physical. Emotional matters as well. So those suffering from injustice, those are ones that get God's heart, have God's heart. Let me see if I can bring that up. Don't know if I have that one ready. I'm going to read it. So in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 12, verse 1, says this, Lord, you always give me justice. When I bring a case before you, you always give me justice. So let me bring this complaint. Now the question is, what is it spiritual to complain? It depends. A complaint is, you're bringing something that is legitimate. It's not illegitimate, right? If you have somebody that's complaining all the time, that's usually self-entitlement. Okay, but Jeremiah says, Lord, I bring my complaint to you. In Matthew chapter 5, remember, the injured party is going to the judge. They are doing what? They're bringing their complaint to the Lord. And so Jeremiah, among other things, says, Lord, why are the wicked so prosperous and why evil people so happy? He goes on to talk about, because he was on the receiving end of injustice, he asked the Lord to get them. That is what we have looked at in the past as an imprecatory prayer. So God cares very much about injustice. That's an umbrella category. There's specific things, not just physical, but how about injustice suffered by workers? In Deuteronomy 24, verse 15, God says this to employers, you must pay workers their wages each day before sunset. So these are almost migrant workers or people that are dependent from day to day. They are barely able to make ends meet. So he says you must pay them their wages each day before sunset because they are poor and they're counting on it. If you don't, they might cry out to the Lord against you, and it would be counted against you as sin. Now, the question is, would they literally cry? Meaning cry out? They might. But even if they don't cry out, what is ascending on their behalf? Their pain. So God notices, God takes notice. And it's not the fact that somebody literally does or doesn't cry out. He hears the cries and the groans of those who have been harmed. That is how much he cares about us. The religious leaders of Jesus' day and the religious leaders of the Old Testament had a wonderful way of compartmentalizing. They allowed their ego to stay intact, and so they were not bothered by their conscience, yet they would go through religious emotions, religious activity. So they would fast. But God is not moved by religious activity devoid of truth, devoid of true justice. And so in Isaiah 58, verse 6, what does God say? Right? They're crying, saying, why don't you listen to us? And he says, I don't want this kind of fasting where you keep food from yourself, but you're harming people. He says this, no, this is the kind of fasting I want. Free those who are wrongly imprisoned. We talked about that last time out of Proverbs. Here it is. Lighten the burden of those who work for you. So if you have somebody working for you, God is watching. And let the oppressed go free and remove the chains that bind people. So oppression is both literal and it doesn't just have to be that I'm physically harming someone. So Cain killed his brother Abel. That was a physical act. But I can be oppressive by words and deeds and thoughts and actions. So I don't have to just draw blood. Let me bring it up again, right? I can end up binding somebody up. How about a guilt trip? How effective can a guilt trip be in a family? You can have somebody that ties people up in knots, and before you know it, they spend the rest of their life trying to live up to or live down things, trying to please someone who will never be pleased, who is not about to give that person the satisfaction of knowing they did a good job well done. Why? Because they're going to keep that person on the hook. That is unjust, and the pain and the exasperation. So, for instance, if you had a parent who never said you were enough, never gave you the sense that you were good enough, what is that doing? That is tying you up in knots. That is putting chains on you. We call it love with strings attached. We call it conditional love. That can keep somebody bound for the rest of their life. In my counseling practice, I deal with adults who are bound because of injustice and people that have withheld, especially the most important people, because you can dump a knapsack on someone in one of two ways. You give them something they don't deserve, or you withhold from them what they do deserve. And we will continue on the other side of the break.
Are you or someone you know a survivor of abuse and wondering where to turn for trustworthy help and insight into the effects of such abuse? Ever wish you had access to a resource that could help you continue your progress in healing? SurvivorSupport.net is that resource. Developed by Jon Uhler, a seasoned therapist with years of experience working with sexual abuse survivors, SurvivorSupport.net is a one-of-a-kind resource to help you understand the impact of abuse and to help you understand the nature of those who harmed you in order to help you gain clarity and continue healing. If you are interested in speaking with Jon Uhler about your situation or in having Jon conduct a consultation or a training for your church or organization, SurvivorSupport.net serves as a convenient method of contacting him. Our program, Journey to Healing, is made possible through the generous donations of viewers like you. There are many opportunities and needs that Survivor Support is attempting to meet, and your monthly support or one-time gift would be extremely helpful as we seek to meet those needs and opportunities. Simply visit SurvivorSupport.net and you will see the link to donate on the homepage. We thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jon Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We're here every Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on TECN.TV, the leader in Internet TV. We are looking at the issue of forgiveness, what is forgiveness versus what it is not, and we're picking up where we left off last time. We were looking at the issue of God's justice and how God's his heart of justice will pick up on behalf of those that have been harmed. So we've looked at a chart. This is a portion of that chart. You see the green arrow ascending. That's the pain. That's the sighs, the cries, and the prayers of the victims. God captures and carries their tears, their pain in a bottle. His heart of protective justice will pick up where they cannot defend themselves. And as the selfish person moves from left to right, becoming ever increasingly hurtful, going from negligence to injustice right across the middle there, then the degree of personal injury gets worse, and God will take up our cause. I recommend you go to SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab to look at some past programs that will bring you up to speed. We were looking at what are some of the categories that have God's heart in terms of who does God protect? What moves God's heart? What category of pain? We looked at, before the break, we looked at murder and assault. So if you've been physically harmed, just like Abel was harmed by his brother Cain, Abel's blood cried out to God. We know it doesn't physically, but God pays attention. He feels it. Those suffering injustice from oppressors. So we looked at in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah says, Lord, I know you will give me justice. You always give me justice when I bring my complaint before you. So those that are suffering any kind of injustice in general. How about injustice suffered by workers? We looked at in Deuteronomy 24, verse 15. God says, you pay workers their worth, you pay them their wage. If you don't, then they might cry out against you and it will be counted as sin. So whether they physically cry out or not, God notices. How about those that are acting unjustly toward others? God said to the Israelites in Isaiah 58:6, he said, this is the kind of fasting I want. Free those that are wrongly imprisoned. That probably is very literally imprisoned. So we need to be active. We need to be activists, ensure people get their rights. But also he says, lighten the burden of those who work for you. You can imprison people in a couple of different ways. So if you're an employer, you need to make sure that you are lightening the burden. Do not use and abuse people, and let the oppressed go free and remove the chains that bind people. Do you have somebody bound up? Right? Are you toying with someone? God pays attention. In Genesis 16:11, another category, what I would say domestic abuse. Hagar, if you're familiar with Hagar, she was being abused and mistreated by Sarah, Abraham's wife, and so she runs. And she is out by herself, and she is lost and distressed. And so the angel of the Lord, there's a Christophany, God appears to her and says, Hagar, you're now pregnant. You're going to give birth to a son, which means, he says, go back, but I will be with you. And he says, you're to name him Ishmael, meaning God hears, for the Lord has heard your cry of distress. So we could say anything in terms of human relations, but especially domestic violence. How about abandonment? A little while later, she actually is sent away. And where is she to go? With her son. This is a number of years later. And they are wandering. And in Genesis 21:17, it says this, but God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, saying, Hagar, what's wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. That was a physical issue. They were going to die of thirst and hunger and starvation, but also the emotional pain of abandonment. And this is a very important category now. This is a broad category, and you will see this all throughout Scripture. It's called, so this is probably the most often used category as far as those who experience pain and their pain rises to God. What would we call them? The poor and the needy, the thirsty and the hungry. That's literal, thirsty and hungry. That's a literal, poor and needy, but that also can be emotional as well. And in Isaiah 41:17, God says this, when the poor and needy search for water, there is none. So that's literal. And their tongues are parched from thirst. That is a very literal thing. So when you read in Scripture, the poor and the needy, it first and foremost is talking about people that are literally in need. though through no fault of their own. This is not the result of irresponsibility. This is a result of something happening to them, and usually it was injustice. And the Lord says, I, the God of Israel, will never abandon them. That is something that the Jews viewed as the promise of God. There's a very important psalm, Psalm 107, and I actually have a picture of it in my Bible. This may be a little small, but we're going to go with it just because I didn't want to type it out for right now. So it's kind of a picture of what my Bible looks like. So I want to point out a couple of things. This particular chapter is very interesting because it shows categories of people that are in pain that God responds to. And so the first are those that, and this is the most important category, if you can see verse 4, it says that some wandered in the wilderness and lost and homeless. Well, why would anybody wander in the wilderness lost and homeless? Because something happened to their home, something happened to drive them away. What would have happened? I'm going to show you the end of the verse, by the way. What would happen? This is in verse 39. When they decreased in number and became impoverished through, and here are the three categories, by the way, of pain, or what will bring pain: oppression, trouble, and sorrow. What you have is sorrow because we live in a fallen world. That is even before people are in our lives. Trouble, it's because there are people that cause trouble, but then there are overtly selfish people. So that would be oppression. And look at what happens because of oppression. Verse 40, the Lord pours contempt on their princes, causing them to wander in trackless wastelands. But he rescues who? The poor and needy from trouble or from affliction. So that is the first category and most important category that we're looking at. What happens with oppression? I want to go back now to the beginning of that chapter. So in Psalm 107, we're looking at different categories that God pays attention to, for better or for worse. In this case, for better right now. So verses 4 through 9, you can see down in, as a matter of fact, I'll read that. Some wandered in the wilderness, lost and homeless, hungry and thirsty. They nearly died. The Lord, help, they cried in their trouble, and he rescued them from their distress. He led them straight to safety, to a city where they could live. So they were aliens. Let them praise the Lord for his great love and for the wonderful things he has done for them. He satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things. That should sound familiar right out of the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, or blessed are those who hunger and thirst. So it's not just spiritual. Going down to verse 10, you're going to see that is actually self-imposed because that self-imposed pain. It's interesting. Those are rebels. If you continue going down, 17 to 21, you then have a prodigal. But the one category, again, that gets God's attention are those that have been on the receiving end of oppression. It is those that have been harmed or who are on the receiving end of hurtfulness that God takes note of. He will take up their cause. And that's what he also wants oppressors to understand, that if you are harming someone, you are getting the attention of the God of the universe. He takes it very seriously. In Psalm 107, verses 39 to 41, again, we read that. I wanted to show you again at the end of that. I read that momentarily. Again, when they decreased in numbers and became impoverished through what? Through oppression, trouble, and sorrow. God pays attention to all that. But again, the pain that rises to his throne is from the pain of oppression And verse 40, causing them to wander in trackless wastelands, meaning they became an alien, and he rescued the poor and troubled and increased their families like flocks of sheep. So again, it's to really emphasize to us a proper understanding of what the Jews understood as far as how God operates. He cares deeply and he doesn't forget pain that we suffer. This is illustrated in a very interesting passage in 2 Samuel in the Old Testament. 2 Samuel 21. I'm going to read a couple of portions because it's very unusual, but it will show that God does not forget. And you would think, since God's people were the Jews, they were the only ones eligible for God's justice. But he wants people to know God is an equal opportunity God. That if I start to do wrong, then I am on the receiving end of his discipline all the way to his justice. But it's not just his people, meaning he cares about everyone. So if somebody is on the receiving end of injustice, especially because of broken promises, God takes note. So in 2 Samuel chapter 21, it's entitled David Avenges the Gibeonites. You may have never heard of the Gibeonites, but we'll pick up. It says this: there was a famine during David's reign that lasted for 3 years. And if you have an agricultural or an agrarian society, 3 years of no rain is going to do what? Now people are going to begin to die of thirst and crop failure. So David asked the Lord about it. That was a smart move, meaning David's life now, the country is being significantly torn apart. So David prays about this. And the Lord said, the famine has come because Saul, that was the preceding bad king that was chasing David before David took over. Remember David and Goliath? Goliath was the enemy of the Israelites. King was Saul was the king at that time. David, remember, he took the little stones and put it in a sling and killed Goliath for Saul. What did Saul do in thanks? Eventually, he started to chase David to kill him. He became jealous and he became a psychopath. Saul did. So Saul then just didn't act unjustly toward David, but the Gibeonites were a people group that had been spared by God. So David said, the Lord said this: the famine has come because Saul and his family are guilty of murdering the Gibeonites. So the king summoned the Gibeonites. So God has said, basically, there's going to be no rain because, David, you actually should have taken care of this. You should have known, but their cries and their sighs are still in my ears. I've stopped the rain. And there ain't going to be no more rain, right? You're going to be in pain until justice is brought to bear. So the king summoned who? The Gibeonites. This had happened years earlier. They were not a part of Israel, but they were all that was left of the nation of the Ammonites. The people of Israel had sworn not to kill them, but Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, no, that was his ego, had tried to wipe them out. David asked them, what can I do for you? Here it is. How can I make amends so that you will bless the Lord's people again? David didn't do this specifically, but it shows you because it was such a heinous act that injustice still had cried out. So the Gibeonites say this: well, money can't settle this matter between us and the family of Saul. The Gibeonites replied, neither can we demand the life of anyone in Israel. Well, David said, what can I do then? Just tell me and I'll do it for you. Then they replied, it was Saul who planned to destroy us, to keep us from having any place at all in the territory of Israel. So let 7 of Saul's sons be handed over to us, and we will execute them before the Lord of Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord. That may sound rash, but it shows you God's heart for those that have been treated unjustly. David acts upon it. He follows through. And in verse 14, it says, then the king ordered that they bury the bones of those men. And after that, God ended the famine in the land. So it can be even those that in one way or another are still crying out for justice, and we may need to get together with them and find out what's it going to take to make you whole. Now, that was a little unique situation, but I want to help us understand that God doesn't forget pain. So the Gibeonites, non-Jews, were what? They were crying out to the Lord, and the Lord noticed. So God doesn't have favorites. God's message of comfort is toward very specific categories: the poor and the needy, those who are mourning and grieving due to pain and grief, and those who are humbly practicing patience, who trust God's promise and who are willing to act with reservation, or are willing to be reserved to give God room to act with patience. And we looked at last time when God says, vengeance is mine, he's not telling people hands off. What he's saying is this: you have one of two options. Do we trust him enough? Trust in the Lord with all of our heart. Don't lean. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, meaning you're reserving the right to act, but you're holding that back. You're acting with patient endurance. Why? Because God says he will take up uh, your cause, so that what? So that you don't have to. The shirt says, I'm going to let God fix it, because if I fix it, it's going to jail. What a tremendous gift that God says to those that have been harmed, that I will take up that for you so that you can know and be still that I am God. And another category is those who hunger and thirst after God to exercise judgment and justice. Let me find this next one here. In I don't know if I have it in front of me, so I'll just read it. In Psalm chapter 9, verse 18, says this: but the needy will not be ignored or forgotten forever. The hopes and the expectations of the poor and the meek will not be crushed. What is their expectation? Lord, do you hear? Do you see? Psalm 10, verses 11 to 18, it says this: the wicked think that God isn't watching us. Or the wicked think, God's not watching us. He has closed his eyes and won't ever see what we're doing. Verse 12, arise, Lord, punish the wicked. Um, don't ignore the helpless, the humble, the patient, and the crushed. Don't ignore the helpless. Why do the wicked get away with it, with despising God? They think God's never going to call us to account. But you see the trouble they cause, Lord. You see the grief. You take note and you punish them. The helpless or the unfortunate put their trust in you. You defend orphans, break the arms of the wicked. These evil people, go after them until the last one is destroyed. The king is king, the Lord is king forever and ever, and the godless nations will vanish. Lord, you know the hopes, which is the desire and the longing and the deep passion of the helpless and the humble and the oppressed. What are they longing for? Lord, you will do justice. It says, surely you will hear the cries and comfort them. The cries of who? Those that have been on the receiving end of oppression. Lord, bring justice, do justice to the orphans and the oppressed, so that man will no longer oppress them any longer. What is the cry of the human heart? What is the cry of those that have been harmed? It is, Lord, do you see? Do you care? God has promised. He's made a promise to those that are hurt. He's made a promise to those that have been on the receiving end of injustice. He has made a promise to the poor. Why would they be poor? Through injustice. Needy, because of injustice. Why are they mourning? Because of injustice and all they've lost. They are willing to trust God's promise, so they don't take matters into their own hands and rewrite Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Therefore, they are meek. God blesses the meek. Why? Because they're giving God and they're trusting him, they're giving him room, and they're trusting that he will see vengeance on their behalf. And ultimately, God will bless those that hunger and thirst after seeing God's justice. What does that sound like? That may sound like Matthew chapter 5 and Luke chapter 6, We call that the very first sermon that Jesus prayed. We're going to look at what was the message, what was the good news to the ears of the Israelites when Jesus began saying, "Blessed are those." Yes, it's spiritual, but it was also to those that had been harmed. That is the good news, and we will see that next time on Journey to Healing.
You've been listening to Journey to Healing, sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. We trust you've been helped by the information our host, Jon Uhler, has shared. To donate to this ministry, schedule a personal consultation with Jon, or to arrange a professional training for your church or organization with Jon, simply visit our website. On behalf of Survivor Support, we look forward to hearing from you and to have you join us next time on Journey to Healing.